go. All right. So this is my presentation on how to inspect and maintain a chainsaw for BIDP 3240. This was also my assignment 3, and so I've just used it. I did the format for assignment 3 where it was the 20 seconds, but the presentation is going to go a little bit different than that. That was quite challenging to do, actually. I found it very entertaining. So we'll do it this way here. All right, so the first thing that we need to be aware of are what tools are required for maintaining a chainsaw. So starting on the left, we have our gloves, which are important because you could easily cut your hands doing this. Safety goggles, and it's just you're dealing with metal and metal filings. You don't want any of that stuff getting into your eyes. Our bar wrench, which is standard equipment for maintaining a chainsaw. It's pretty much the only tool you need to take it apart. A couple of round files of different diameter, just depending on what type of chain you're dealing with and the pitch that you'll be dealing with. A flat file, and this will be to file down your depth gauges, and I'll talk more about that a little later. And then a spare chain. If you're in a situation where your chain is now worn to the point it needs replacing, you should always have a spare chain on hand. So when we're looking at our chainsaw, we do a visual inspection first. And so we start with, I can't see over on the right-hand side. There we go. So we start with the casing. You want to make sure your casing isn't cracked. This is where your air filter is. And if it's cracked, you're going to get a bunch of dust and debris inside the engine components, and you don't want that to happen. So make sure that that's intact. The second is this safety mechanism. And this doesn't allow you to pull the trigger or throttle without having that, the rear handle here engaged. And so that's a safety mechanism, so you're not going to cut yourself when the saw is operational. You want to make sure that works. You got your fuel tank. You want to make sure that it's seated correctly and you're not leaking any fuel. And then where your bar oil goes, you're going to want to make sure that's not leaking as well. Although bar oil these days is environmentally safe, you still don't want everything that you're working with covered in oil because that is it's a hazard. All right, so once we looked at the first side, we're going to move on to the second side. We have our chain brake handle. You want to make sure this is operational and not cracked so that it engages and disengages properly. The other side of the casing, so on the back side here, once again, no cracks. We've got our bar nuts. You want to make sure these are not cracked and they are present so that you're not missing one. Happens quite often, these will rattle off and that will make it unstable for your chain and bar. We have this chain stay down here. And as you can see, this one's a little bit worn. You want to make sure this is here. This is what protects your leg and your hand if this chain was to snap during operation. Having a closer look at the side of the saw, we can see that both of our bar nuts are here. They're not cracked. There's not any micro fractures anywhere. We want to have a closer look at this chain stay. Like I said, you can see it's worn along the edge just a little bit here, but when this thing is ready to go, it'll be about halfway. It's made out of aluminum, so it is a wearable part. However, if it's missing, it needs to be addressed and replaced. All right, disassembly is our next step. So you want to make sure that your chain brake handle is in the released position so that your chain can move freely. The reason we do that is when we make the adjustments, we want the chain to be able to gain slack, and I'll show what that looks like a little bit later here. Your bar nuts, you're going to want to make sure that you turn them counterclockwise and loosen them off. Otherwise, you will not be able to add slack into your chain and therefore not being able to disassemble your chainsaw. So you do that to both of them. And then with the adjustment hole here, you would put your bar wrench in there, the flathead end, you turn counterclockwise and you'll gain slack in your chain. And I didn't really show it well in this presentation now that I'm looking at it, but you can see there's a little gap here at the bottom of the chain compared to here where there's no gap. And that's from loosening this adjustment screw. The chain gains slack and it allows all this stuff to be removed when you get to that stage. So once you've got those bar nuts loosened up, you can loosen the rest away with your hands and then lift this casing right off. Now, if you've used your saw like I did for any length of time as a production saw, you're going to gain all this junk that's in there, and you should be scraping that out every so often because this is a combination of bar oil and sawdust, and it will gum up the inside of your saw and impede your performance. So you can just scrape that out and knock it out onto a garbage bin or even on the ground, really. Like I said, the bar oil is environmentally friendly, and it's just sawdust in here. So with the casing removed, you'll want to make sure that your slack is in the chain, and it is here. What I've done is I've grabbed onto the chain, pushed backwards so that I gain slack in this area here. And so what that allows me to do is disengage these teeth from the flywheel. Now, if you're having trouble with that, you just grab onto it with a gloved hand, that's important, and give it a good shove to the rear, and it should come off quite effectively from the actual studs. Okay, so if you're using your saw a lot like I do, then these edges, once you've got the chain off, can develop a burr. So the chain spinning around the bar actually causes the metal to mushroom out a little bit, and that'll create a sharp edge along here. If you have that, you need to take your flat file and file that down so that there's not a cutting hazard there. And of course, we're going to look for other things like these cavitation wear marks. Make sure there's no cracks in here, make sure your bar isn't bent, and that this sprocket at the end is spinning freely. Once we've done our inspection there, we can put our chain and bar back on. And here you can see is a good example of the slack that exists in the chain. Now, also you might notice that the bar is put on upside down in this case. It's good practice that every time you take the chain off to sharpen it or maintain, you flip it over again. And then that will allow you to accomplish equal wear on both sides of that bar. Now, we can see here that there are little teeth that keep it in the guide along the bar. It's important to make sure that those little teeth line up with this flywheel on the backside here. If these teeth are on the outside, it's not going to work properly. You'll be able to put the saw together, but it won't work. And so you need to make sure that these little teeth are inside the groove on that flywheel. All right, time for reassembly. Once you have the chain loosened off and it's all stuck back to the saw like that, you can put your casing on with the bar nuts, hand tighten them. Then what you want to do while they're hand tight is put once again, your flathead end of your bar wrench into the adjustment hole. Now you're going to turn it clockwise versus counterclockwise because you want to tighten them, and that'll take all the slack out of this chain. Now here you can see there's a little bit, and that's okay. As long as these teeth are still within their set here, that is all right. You'll figure out what works best for your saw as far as tightening goes. Now when it comes to tightening the bar nuts, after you've taken the slack out of your chain, it's important to only tighten these bar nuts as tight as 1 finger's worth of pressure can push down on that wrench. Anything tighter and you're going to end up stripping these nuts out and you'll cause damage to your saw. So it doesn't need to be super tight, it just needs to be tight enough. When it comes to filing your saw, I would recommend that you have a bench vise if you're going to be doing this often like I was. And a bench vise here that has an articulating or an angled head, so you can put it whatever angle you need to accomplish good reach over all of these teeth. When we're looking at the tooth, you can see it's made up of 2 components. We have the front here called the depth gauge and the rear called the tooth. Now the tooth has a wear mark on it, as does the depth gauge, but you can't see it from this angle. You shouldn't file past this mark. Doing so could cause your saw to experience catastrophic failure. So typically, we use our chains till they're about down to this mark here, and then we'll discard the chain for a new one. When you're filing your chain, it's important to pick the diameter of file that is just a little bit bigger than the tooth. So it'll be a little bit higher, and what that causes is an upward angle towards the front of the tooth, and it gives it good biting capacity to remove wood chips. When you're filing the saw, you want pressure moving across the saw and a little bit of pressure coming backwards, not too much because the file can slip up and out, but you do want just enough to be able to remove material from the front of that tooth. Looking at the side profile of our tooth and our depth gauge, you can see that they also carry this wear mark. You shouldn't file below those marks or beyond these marks. That's a good indication that the saw or the chain is ready for replacement. Speaking of that depth gauge, this is what sets the thickness of a wood chip that comes out. So when you take down that depth gauge, this right here would be the thickness of the piece of wood that will come out from your chain. So if this depth gauge is above your tooth, it won't cut anything. You need to make sure the depth gauge is below the front leading edge of that tooth. So essentially every time you file the tooth down, you need to give 1 or 2 passes on those depth gauges to keep them at a good calibration. And you would do that simply by using your flat file across the top of that depth gauge, give it 1 or 2 passes, and you would move that down the bar and chain and just file off whichever one's needed it. The one final step we have here is air filter cleaning. So you just take the flathead end of your bar wrench and turn counterclockwise on the 3 or more, sometimes there's less studs that exist to hold that casing on. And then you'd be able to pull that case freely off of here. And of course, you can see that here's the air filter, and you can see there's all this grit in here. So that impedes the performance of being able to get enough air to run effectively. Turn that counterclockwise to take it off. And then you would just bang it out on your workbench and discard the debris. And that's it. There are no references here. This is all industry gained experience. I can see that we've got less than a minute. Parul, would you mind just opening the meeting again, and we'll join again to the same link?
Okay, fine. Yeah.
Okay.
Okay. I thought that we'll need to arrange it again, actually. So I was messaging that maybe
Oh,
she
we
would
can
need-
use same link.
We can,
Sure.
yeah.
Okay.